Please be welcome to the Pommel Horse flop rule presentation. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about flop rule basic concepts. Then we're going to talk about some key points that I consider important, front and side support positions. Then we're going to talk about some elements that are not directly related to the flops, like front loops and side circles. And then we're going to see all the variations of the components of the flops, Stockley B, the Pomeloops, and direct Stockley A's. Then we're going to see several examples of flop sequences and analyze each one of them. Some abbreviations that we're going to use in this video. These are not official, just for practical purposes. A side circle is going to be identified as an L, a Q for the front loops, an O for loops on one pommel, an S for Stockley B, and an S with an A for the Stockley A's. Flops are sequences of 3 or 4 elements combined together on a single pommel. Flops can only be composed of the following elements: side circles in one pommel, which have not been performed in competition for several cycles; cross support circles on one pommel, which are more common, Stockley B and Stockley A. Because of the nature of the Stockley A, which finishes outside of one pommel, it can only be included as the final component of a flop sequence. We're going to show several examples about the Stockley A so that by the end of the presentation you can be able to identify correctly this element. As we said before, flops can only be composed of 3 or 4 elements. If 3 flops are performed, they receive the difficulty value of D. 4 flops have an E value, and if these are performed in flares, there is an upgrade of 1 letter. 2 consecutive different flops, they receive a value of B plus B. It is not a flop, but we have to talk about this. And 2 consecutive similar flops are considered B plus basic repetition. Only 1 flop sequence can be performed inside a competition exercise. Another basic concept is that only 2 similar flops can be performed in direct sequence. A third flop would break this rule, and a single combined value could not be awarded. For example, if a gymnast performs a loop, 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 and then a Stockley, the value would be a B plus repetition, and the 4th component would not receive value either, so no value for the last Stockley. If a gymnast performs Stockley plus 3 loops, then the first 2 receive their independent value of B plus B, and the rest is considered repetition, and no flop rule can be awarded for credit. Individual values can only be awarded provided there is no fall. Flops with falls receive no credit, and this is a similar rule like Russians and Mayer and Civalo travels. If there is a fall, no partial credit. In more basics, we're going to define and show the side position as the relation of the transverse axis of the body with the longitudinal axis of the horse. We can see the red line as the long axis of the horse and the green line as the transverse axis of the body. These can be the start and end positions of a flop, and in the case of the last picture in the right, it can be in the middle of a flop. Front support and front position, again we have the relation of the 2 axes, and in this case the relation changes to a cross position. And also these pictures, they can be the start or end position of a flop, and in the case of the middle and right picture, it can be presented as a middle position in a flop sequence. This position is also important. It's a front support cross position with one hand on leather and one hand on the pommel. and this can be the initial position of a flop sequence. Before we start with flops, we must review some elements that are related to flops, like front loops on the end and side circles. Front loops may start with both hands on the leather, or one hand on the leather and one hand on the pommel. Front loops usually end on front support, but may also end in side support. Although this is not related to flops, this can be seen before handstand dismounts or before Russians, but it's important that every judge knows how to evaluate this quarter turn in front loops. As we saw in the previous slides, this can be the start and end positions of a front loop on the end. The end position is very important that we make a mental picture of it, one hand on the pommel and one hand on the leather. This will help us understand the drawings that are shown in the code of points. This drawing from the code of points shows the most usual variation, start and end with both hands on leather. However, the other variation starts with both hands on leather and ends one hand on leather and one hand on the pommel, which is the important to understand. Now in practice, we're going to see examples. This is the start position, both hands on leather. Now we see a first loop completed, finishing in the same position. A second loop, also both hands on leather. And the third one is going to end with one hand on the handle and one hand on the leather. Another example, starting both hands on leather. First loop, both hands on leather, and the next loop includes a quarter turn to side support position. As we saw with loops which start in front support, side circles will always start in side support but may end in side or front support. A rule is that all basic circles in front or side support, also on one pommel, may end with a quarter turn without changing their basic structure or value. It is very important that judges do not miss the recognition of circles before or after a flop sequence. Again, a practical view of the side circles. We see the start position, both hands on pommels in side support, and the first circle is completed. Then we see a second circle finishing in the same position, and the third one is going to include a quarter turn to cross support on one pommel. We're going to study the elements that make up flops. We're going to start with Stockley's, direct Stockley B. All Stockley A or B start and end in side support. Stockley B can only be performed from side support, both hands on pommels, from side support, one hand on leather, one hand on pommel, or from side support, both hands on one pommel. This last variation may only be in the middle of a flop sequence. As we can see in the drawing from the code of points, Stockley B starts and ends in side support. This is very important because this will make it easier for us to make a difference between the Stockleys and the other elements that can be part of a flop sequence. We're going to see some practical examples of the Stockley B. Here we have two Stockleys performed, one up and one down. In this example, we're going to analyze every single element performed on every front support. Even though some of these elements are not related to flop, it is very important for us to recognize them. This video doesn't take into account basic repetitions, so we're going to see that 3 or maybe more basic circles are performed, and we say there is 1, 2, 3, etc. We see here the gymnast jumping into the start position on side support, one hand on leather, one hand on pommel. Then he finishes the first circle, a second side circle, and then he starts the Stockley B, which ends in side support, both hands on one pommel, and then a side circle from side to side support, then the Stockley B down to the leather, and another side circle. So he has performed about 5 or 6 elements in this sequence. Now we will see another variation. Here is in normal speed. We will see the start position in side support is the same example we saw previously, ending both hands on one pommel, and this is the start position of the second Stockley B, and ends again side support, both hands on one pommel. This can only be performed in the middle of a flop sequence. Now that we have seen the Stockley B, we're going to talk about Pomeloops. There are 9 ways to perform a Pomeloop. The code of points describes 8 of them, and 7 are related to flops. Pomeloops may start and end from front to side, side to front, or front to front, but never side to side. Remember, this is a characteristic of the Stockleys, and that will make it easier for us to make a difference between Pomeloops and Stockleys. We are now going to see every variation of the Pomeloop. Variation number 1 starts in side support and ends on front support. This is as shown in the code of points. We see here in the example the start position, side support, both hands on one handle, and the end position is in cross support, both hands on the pommel. We can see here another variation is the same. This is not drawn in the code of points. The start position is side support, both hands on pommels and not on one pommel, but the end position is the same. Cross support with both hands on one pommel. Number 2 starts from side and ends in front support. This is basically the same position we saw in the first 2 variations, but in this case the start position is in side support with one hand on the leather and one hand on the pommel, as we can see here. This is the start position. Then the gymnast goes around, completes the loop, and ends in cross support with both hands on one pommel. Variation number 3 starts in front support, cross support on one pommel, and ends in the same position, cross support on one pommel. This is known as the Bailey. We can see here the gymnast performing a side circle with a quarter turn to arrive to the initial position, cross with 2 hands on one pommel. Then he goes around, does the loop, and ends in the same position, both hands on one pommel in cross support. Variation number 4, from front to front, but the starting position is from the leather and pommel. We can see here some loops on the end are performed, and the last loop ends with one hand on pommel and one hand on the leather. This is the start position. This can be the start position of a whole sequence, and then the end position is cross support, both hands on one pommel. Number 5 starts in front support and ends in side support, both hands on one pommel. The drawing we see from the back, but we're going to see clear in this example. Cross support, both hands on one pommel, then a quarter turn, and the end position is side support, both hands on one pommel. Variation number 6 goes from front support to side support outside of the pommel. This is important not to confuse with the Stockley A. We're going to see later the differences. We see the start position in cross support, both hands on one pommel, and the gymnast goes around, performs a quarter turn, and the end position side support, both hands on the pommels. Variation number 7 goes from cross support to side support on one pommel. This is very popular position to start a flop sequence. You can see here the loops on the end, then the start position, one hand on pommel, one hand on leather in cross support, and then the gymnast goes up to the pommel, performs a quarter turn, and ends on side support, both hands on one pommel. Example number 8, we will not show examples because this is not related to flops, because this variation starts and ends on the outside of one pommel, so it cannot be part of the flop sequence. The last element that can be performed in flop sequences is the direct stock-lie. As we have said before, all stock-lies start and end in side support. A stock-lie may only be part of a flop if it started from side support, both hands on one handle. This means that the gymnast has already included a quarter turn to arrive to this position, plus another quarter turn which will be performed in order to place his hands in side support, one hand on each of the pommels. Because the direct stock-lie ends out of the one pommel, it can only be performed at the end of a flop sequence. We're going to see several examples of this. We're going to see the normal stock-lie plus the flop stock-lie. This is the normal way to perform a stock-lie. It cannot be part of the flop because it's outside of one pommel. It starts inside support out of the pommel and includes a quarter turn in and out to arrive to a side position outside the pommels. If the stock-lie is started side position, both hands on one pommel, then it can be part of the flop sequence. You can see here there's a quarter turn and a quarter turn out to a side position with both hands on both pommels. We're going to see some flop examples of some commonly used sequences. We're going to analyze them, and then we're going to do some practice exercises, which we're going to see normal speed and slow motion, and then analyze each part of the sequence. First example is a loop-loop stock-lie B, stock-lie B. We're going to see it first in normal speed. Now we're going to see every front support position. We start here. We're going to start here. Then from this point, the gymnast moves and does a side circle. Remember the abbreviations. This is a side circle, then goes up into one pommel from side support to front support, so it's a loop. Starts from front support to side support, so it's another loop. And from this position, he goes around and ends on side support, both hands on pommel, so this is a stock-lie B. This position is the start position, and goes around and ends in side support, both hands on one pommel. So he completes 4 flop sequences, which is E value, and then he performs another turn to side support, which is a check. This is a B value element. Next example is a 3 flop element for a D value, a loop-loop stock-lie. So we have here the starting position after some scissors. The other front support ends here, and so this is a side circle, an A value from group 2. another side circle. Then from side support, hands on both pommels, he goes around, ends in cross support on one pommel. So this is a loop. From cross support to side support, it's another loop. And from side support, he goes around and ends in side support, both hands on one pommel. So it's a Stockley for a D value. Then he does some side circles also. We have one circle here. Then from this position he goes again to the same position, so it's another side circle. And the last side circle before he goes into some other elements. Another example, this is Stockley B, and loop loop. This is a very interesting example. In this case, after a Russian in one pommel, the start position is side support, both hands on one pommel. He performs a side circle, which is going to be the starting position for the flop sequence. Goes into one pommel from side support to side support in one pommel, so it's a Stockley. From side support to another side support, that's another Stockley. And now from side support to cross support, so this is a loop, and this is very interesting. He is starting in cross support and includes a quarter turn to side support. So this is a loop. This is not a Stockley A because no quarter turn was included in the start of the element. And then he performs a cross travel, which is credited as a B value element. The same example but performed in another way. Stockley, Stockley, loop, loop. We're going to see it in normal speed here. So we're going to see the start position in side support, both hands on pommels. Then completes a side circle. And then he's going around into one pommel from side support to side support in one pommel. So side is a Stockley. From side support he goes again into side support, so that's another Stockley. And now from side support he goes to cross support for a loop, and then he starts in cross support, includes a quarter turn to side support in one pommel, so that's another loop. And here he goes from side support to cross support on the end, and that's a side circle. Very important to recognize that one. Next example is Stockley, loop, loop, and another Stockley. Here is in normal speed. We're going to see some side circles before. This is the starting position in side support. First side circle. We have a second side circle, and then he's going to start the flop sequence. He's going from side support to side support, so that's a Stockley. Then the starting position is from side support to cross support, that's a loop. And now from cross support to side support on one pommel, it's another loop. And now from side support he goes around to side support. That completes the sequence. flop is a knee, and he goes down to a side circle, and he's going to perform a combined sequence, which is not the objective of this presentation, but we're going to analyze it. He went from side to front support for a loop, from cross to side for another loop on one pommel, and then he's going to do a 180 degrees Russian, ending in side support on one pommel, and yet another side circle down to the end of the horse. We have seen some clear examples of flop sequences. Now we're going to practice. I want you to see them in normal speed, then in slow motion, and then we're going to analyze them. Okay, good luck. Okay, in this case we see the starting position and side support, both hands on the pommels. We see a side circle finishing in cross support, and then the flop starts. One pommel loop from cross to cross, then from cross support to side support, that's another loop with a quarter turn, and then he goes around and goes out of the pommel with 1/4 turn, and that's a Stockley A. So this is a D sequence of 3 elements. Then we see some side circles, in this case we see the gymnast, after some scissors, getting into his start position, side support, both hands on pommels. Then he goes around and does a side circle, to side support, that's a Stockley. Then from side support to cross support, that's a loop. Then from cross to side support, another loop with a quarter turn. Then he goes around again like the previous example and goes out of the pommel with a quarter turn. What is this? It's again like in the example previously shown, it's a Stockley A. So it's a knee flop sequence. Then we have some side circle again, This is a very interesting example which happens in competition. We have the start position, side support, both hands on pommels, then a side circle, and he goes into one pommel for his sequence from side support, finishing now in side support. That's the Stockley. From this position in side support, he goes around to side support in one pommel, so it's a second Stockley B. And from this position, he's going again into side position in one pommel, so it's a third Stockley B. This is a violation of the flop rule. He only gets credit for the first Stockley, a B, and then is basic repetition. We can see here a side circle again. This is a very interesting practice for the eyes. We can see here the start position in side support. Then he performs a side circle with a quarter turn to arrive to the starting flop sequence position in cross support. From cross support, he goes around to a side support. That's a loop, not a Stockley, it's a loop. From side, he goes to cross support. That's another loop. And from cross support, he goes to side support. That's a third loop, which it's a violation to the rule. And from side support, he goes to side support for a Stockley. However, he can only be credited for the first loop, so only a B for this sequence. And then he goes to another side circle. So it's a very interesting example. This is another very interesting example. We see the start position, side support, both hands on pommels, performing a side circle to the same position he started. Now he goes around from side support to side support, both hands on the pommel. It's a Stockley. And from side support, he goes around to cross support. So it's a loop. From cross support, he goes to cross support, so it's another loop. And from cross support, he goes around with a quarter turn at the end, and that's a third loop. So it's a violation. He only gets credit for the first two elements, B plus B, and then repetition. However, this is a very interesting example because this is another starting position. He starts with side to side. So this is a Stockley A, which has no relation to flops and should be given credit. For the last example, we see the gymnast jump into the start position, both hands on leather in cross support. Then he goes around to a loop on the end, ending in the same position. Then he does a second loop, one hand on the leather, one hand on the pommel, to start his flop sequence. Now he goes around into side position from cross to side, that's a loop. This was considered a Stockley B in previous cycles, so we must make sure this is not recognized as a Stockley. Now from side support he goes to side support, and this is a Stockley B. From side he goes to cross support for another loop, and then from cross support to cross support for another loop. This is an E flop, and after he finishes the flop sequence he goes down to perform a 1/3 cross travel for an A value. So this is a very interesting example also. I want to show you this example of flops performed in flares, which has never been competed. You can analyze it. I want to thank everyone for listening to this presentation. Have a nice day, everyone.